Well, thanks a lot for staying with us here on Sunrise Live on E on this Hope Day Wednesday. Now, Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba is preparing for an international trip aimed at restoring confidence in the South African economy. This comes after two ratings agencies downgraded the country's credit status. So joining us this morning to talk about this and more, as well as where do we stand when it comes to our finance ministry, we have got in studio with us Director and Chief Economist, Econometrix, Dr. Azar Jammine. Now, I invite you as always to be part of our conversation this morning. Remember, we're available on Facebook as well as on Twitter. Dr. Azar, always a pleasure having you in studio with us.
Thank you, Faye.
Now, when we're looking at where the finance minister currently stands, in fact, it was an interesting conversation you and I were actually having off air, saying that unfortunately for the finance minister at this stage, he's at a lose-lose situation when it comes to sort of allaying any form of investor confidence and marrying that against expectations of the South African public. So let's expound a little bit on that.
Yes, on the one hand, his main economic advisor, who was appointed last week, in an opinion piece in the Business Times, spoke about the need for nationalisation of banks, insurance companies and mines, and expropriation of land without compensation. Now, those go totally counter to the ANC's official policies, and yet, at the same time, people will ask, well, if we're not going to do that, then what was the whole point of getting rid of Pravin Gordhan and replacing him with Malusi Gigaba? So Gigaba's got a huge problem. On the one hand, if he does what his advisor says he should do, Chris Malikani, and does what a lot of people want him to do, he's going to alienate the business community completely, and we'll be downgraded further, and we will end up in junk status on all our credit ratings, and the rand could collapse, interest rates soar, and capital investment collapse as well. And
you know what's so interesting to note, and this is through various reports, this is through whether you can say it's through political posturing or even some words of factionalism being sent through to the media, is that we've got even members of the ANC who, when the junk status came out with Standard & Poor as well as Fitch, it was, we can overcome a downgrade. There's no problem with the downgrade. A downgrade does not mean it's the end of the world. But now the apparent visit to actually encourage and increase investor confidence means that the finance ministry is actually really worried.
Of course, at the end of the day, National Treasury is a huge team of professionals, and they are petrified about what could be happening in the future. And the most important thing is to ensure that there is no further downgrade, because we haven't seen the worst yet. It's only Fitch who has downgraded us both on both foreign currency and local currency debt to junk status. Standard & Poor's downgraded us to junk only on foreign currency debt, but 90% of the debt in South African government bonds is held in local currency bonds, and we are still investment grade as far as Standard & Poor's is concerned, and as far as Moody's goes. So we haven't seen the worst in terms of the potential for large-scale capital outflows if we do get further downgraded. So, you know, there is a point, there is a sense in which Malusi Gigaba should be trying to do damage control. But then he appoints a economic advisor who is really badly advised, ill-advised.
Yeah, but then you see, that's just one side of his problems, because on one side we've got Chris Malikani, who many would say, look, he was a university professor, Harvard's university professor. He's got some strong standpoints in terms of where he sees that economic policy should be going in terms of the country. But on the other hand, he's got the resignation of the Director General, who's been working in Treasury for about 20 years over. So that means that you were speaking about professionals, but when the professionals themselves are resigning from the very same office that they're supposed to be perhaps creating the stability front, does that not then become a cause for concern, especially for those that are on the outside that are looking in?
It's a major cause for concern, and that's going to be a critical issue, who Gigaba elects as the new Director General of Finance. Having said that, the National Treasury goes far deeper than just the Director General. There are a lot of top-line professionals there, and the key is to try and retain them within that Treasury. But they, of course, are versed in the kind of policy of fiscal consolidation that Pravin Gordhan was pursuing. So there are these huge contradictions in terms of trying to turn this thing around completely to embark upon populist policies such as nationalization and land expropriation.
Let's bring this conversation a bit home in terms of you and me and how it will affect us, because in often cases when we sit down with economists, and you would appreciate this, we have this very elevated conversation about the economy, about treasury, about the finance ministry, and it almost appears as though South Africans feel as though they are not as yet affected because it appears to be a problem amongst suits. But now when we're bringing it down home, we've got the petrol price that is set to increase, I think it's next month. We've got, and this is going to be an increase by 50 cents. We've got the actual issues around grants. So when issues on the downgrade happened, South Africans were saying, no, it's fine. We can survive a downgrade, but nobody taking into consideration the knock-on effects as a result of that very same downgrade we speak of.
You're absolutely correct there. But you know, everyone's talking about petrol prices and the rand, the rand hasn't fallen that much yet.
Yeah.
And so there's not, no need to panic yet. But the real damage is that there is so much uncertainty within the business community that you're going to see a massive fall in capital investment in new projects, and that means you can forget about job creation. You're rather going to see job destruction going forward, and that's what affects the man in the street. He's got to be very uncertain about keeping his job at the moment.
It almost appears as though South Africa is fast approaching a stage of the revolt of the poor. And we always speak about the revolt of the poor because the poor will not revolt unless they feel as though their pockets are being affected, that their livelihoods, that bread on the table kind of conversation where if you remove the bread, I've got no livelihood, I've got no survival. Are we going to be seeing a revolt of the poor? Should we not be able to stabilize the situation, especially when it comes to economic policies?
There has to be a strong risk that we end up that way, yes. That is the real danger. Or alternatively, what does the government do to get out of that situation is when its back is to the wall, it just starts printing money to pay its way. And we saw to the north of us what that leads to, massive inflation, ultimately. Initially, it's people can, benefit from it, but for a very short period of time, and before you know it, you get massive inflation, huge increases in interest rates, and a total collapse in the economy.
Let me ask you this. When it comes to conversations such as this, you would find even on social media, and I call them the social media journalists, but even the spectators in terms of how markets are faring, and those who would be opinionists when it comes to the economic policies of South Africa as well as where we're standing, many would say that this is what it takes for us to have radical economic transformation and the demonopolization of white monopoly capital.
Yes, they're probably correct that is maybe what is required, but then you don't have much of a South Africa left for the masses to pick themselves up for. And in particular, what concerns me is if the majority of the masses are relatively uneducated and unable to produce things. At the moment, we're still managing to produce enough to earn foreign exchange, to get foreign investors to buy our government bonds, to sustain our ability to import decent goods and services. But if that disappears, then, and people are not productive enough and educated enough to start producing goods and services themselves, then there won't be those goods and services that we're currently consuming, and very nicely, thank you.
I'm going to stay on this point of economic transformation and issues around, because this is going to be a conversation you and I are going to have anyways until probably the cows come home. White monopoly capital. That term has been a term that has been utilized since the local government elections last year in August.
Yes, it was coined by Bell Pottinger, by the way.
There we go. So now South Africans have taken it and taken ownership of it, perhaps not even understanding the full extent of white monopoly capital. In your opinion, is this country still very much white monopoly owned? Is it still very much a white monopoly? And how then do we achieve this with also taking into consideration that we do need to sustain this economy and still need to be able to be transparent and transformed? I'm
not sure how much of the ownership is still in white hands, but certainly a lot of the management of the country's economy is still in white hands.
Yeah.
And it's a huge challenge, because you need experience to be able to run companies, and to bring professional blacks in to run them is a challenge because they don't have the requisite experience yet.
Is that why we're finding that many companies would rather hire foreign nationals who may be black, because it's usually black foreign nationals, to manage the very same companies instead of local, what do we call, personnel or local human capital to run some of the companies?
You're absolutely correct, and in many respects South Africa has been saved by some of Zimbabwe's problems because they have highly educated, highly professional black persons who have come in and done some wonderful work here, which could not be done by the locals because of the lack of appropriate education and skills development.